I know you saw the title of this video. If you just want to see Bad Apple being played, skip to the time interval on screen. However, if you do want to know what's going on, I do encourage sticking around. There's a lot of context to talk about. So, in the past, I've made a lot of different types of displays. Many of them are analog. However, this video will not discuss any of those mechanisms. Instead, we will be covering digital-ish displays, specifically a dot matrix display. For distinction, I will be calling these dots, and the whole thing as a dot matrix display. Pixels and pixel displays will be used to refer to these displays. A feature that PolyBridge 2 has, and which most other bridge building games do as well, is the ability to see stresses built up in the parts of the bridge. A material is displayed as green when unstressed, and gradually becomes red the more stressed it becomes, until it breaks, of course. That said, however, PolyBridge 2 has another feature that is useful. It has the option to make bridge materials unbreakable. PolyBridge 1 has this feature as well. However, the way it does it is different. It does this by removing the stress calculation entirely from the material. PolyBridge 2, however, does calculate it, and so in stress view, you still keep the colors. This was pretty much perfect for someone to realize what he could do with that. Our story begins only a week after PolyBridge 2 was released to the public. Weirdly enough, we were actually already pretty close at the time to figuring out the display that we know of today. Just for fun, Concord made a small display using roads. Thanks to PolyBridge 2's features, we could change the color of the roads by changing how stressed they are. The method that is used here is by dropping custom shapes in the buckets made out of roads. The custom shapes are heavy enough that when they land in the buckets, the roads become stressed. However, this prototype is missing a lot of components and has a couple of issues. The first thing is that it uses red and green for off and on, so the contrast isn't great. This is especially bad for folks who are red-green colorblind. Thankfully, the devs thought about this and made colorblind mode for PolyBridge, which is a gradient from white to black, so that problem is pretty easy to solve. The second bigger problem, however, is this method can only make static renders. Once the custom shapes were dropped, that was it. You couldn't pick them back up. That said, one idea to make it reusable was to connect them up with a hydraulic. Then you can raise and lower the custom shapes. This, however, brings two issues. The first is that custom shapes cause a lot of lag, and the second is that the hydraulics also end up being stressed. They end up changing color, muddling the contrast. We did come up with some designs that fix the contrast muddling issue by placing the triggers above and using springs to engage stress on the roads directly, though this still only created static renders. In order for hydraulics to be implemented, we needed to go bigger. So that didn't come until much later, like 4 years later. We put this into our checklist of PolyTech ideas and had plans to work on it, but we might have forgotten it. We started again last March, and yes, we already had our eyes set on making Bad Apple right from the get-go when we picked this project back up. I mean, it's literally going to be a black and white display. Don't tell me that's not the first thing that would come up in your mind as well. We were coming up with a lot of different designs, including this one, which we will get back to later. I did, however, manage to stumble into this design, which is what we would eventually make the display out of. It uses a little bit of clever shared materials. This is one dot. The hydraulics are set to 1% contraction, which is sufficient to get the roads stressed enough and appear jet black. However, in the resting state, they dangle a little bit, which means they're left a little bit stressed. This is solved by adding 2 tiny guiding arms on each of them. As it turns out though, you can have adjacent dots in place of the guiding arms. This does mean that an active dot does slightly deform its neighbors, but this is so minute that a color change isn't registered at all on the adjacent dot. Our hydraulics are kept close to the absolute shortest they can be. They're 1/4 square root 2 meters long, contracting 1%, meaning each one pulls about 3.5 millimeters. If you run through the maths, you find the unwanted deflection to be only around 4 micrometers. For reference, a tissue box hanging off the side of your table deflects down more than that. I went ahead and proved it. Together, they can be tiled like this. And just like that, we have a display that not only solves the issue of reusability, but also removes custom shapes from the design altogether. There are 2 issues with the display though. The first is that every other pair of dots in the vertical direction has a gap, meaning that every dot is scaled vertically by 1.25. This can be solved by just expanding the horizontal dimension by 1.25 as well, so rather than a 40 by 30 dot matrix display, we will be using a 50 by 30 dot matrix display. The second issue is something that is much more problematic though: stages. Stages themselves have 2 major limitations that nearly killed this project. The first issue is the refresh rate. With stages in series like this, a new stage cannot begin before the previous stage is complete. This itself has 2 issues. Yes, this is starting to sound like one of those homework questions with a billion parts to them, but we're already down here, so we're gonna keep going. In this specific case, a hydraulic phase's duration is dependent on how long the longest lasting hydraulic is active for. The longer it takes to contract or expand, the longer the stage will last. Concord ran the game's hydraulic expansion code in Python and found that the hydraulic with those properties runs for 13 frames, which, after converting, is approximately 1/4 second. But that 1/4 second is not 0 seconds. And that's an issue because on any hydraulic phases where none of the hydraulics are active, the longest lasting hydraulic is simply nothing. And so this 1/4 second delay does not exist, which causes the frame rate to be inconsistent. Now, you can solve this by just adding hydraulic off-screen that's active on every phase. But this won't fix the second issue. The hydraulic phase actually has a second type of delay. Even without hydraulics, the hydraulic phase has a minimum runtime of 50 frames, along with 2 additional frames, one to initiate the hydraulic phase, and one to finish it and call the next stage. So already, the fastest our refresh rate can be is less than a frame per second. And it gets worse when you realize that this is 1 second in the simulation. In actuality, with this many dots, rendering that simulation takes much longer. And that isn't the worst part. The biggest issue is this. Stages are labeled alphabetically. This was a design choice that's been around since PolyBridge 1, as typically levels don't have anything more than a handful of stages. But just in case people would use more stages than the letters in the alphabet, the devs decided to implement 2 character stages. This bumps up the number of stages from 26 to 702. And the devs thought that this should surely be enough. Nobody with any sane mind would create a level that needs more than 702 stages. Unfortunately, we are not sane, and that was a big problem because the devs capped it. You can't normally place them in manually, and even if you could by going back to an older version and saving, the file becomes corrupted and you cannot open it. The game was just not programmed to handle loading more than 702 stages. So with only 702 stages running at 30 frames per second, every layout file would only be able to render 23.4 seconds. Run at 60 frames per second, and a layout file can't even render 12 seconds of footage. So we can't even load in a layout file, set it going, and then come back later once it's done the full animation. We would have to come back and load in the next file and repeat that over and over and over again. There are just so many complications that come with trying to program this with staging, but look, what other options do we even have? Either we're going to have to shelve this project again, or we find a better way to do this now. Concord, what the f? Well, okay, that's a thing you can do. Normally in-game, it's impossible to put two hydraulic phases in the same stage. But it turns out that you can do that using file editing. The game serializes and deserializes layout files before it loads it in. If we hook up a script to the deserializer, we can see what the deserialized form of the layout looks like. We can strip away most of the data here that we either don't need in order to make the screen, or that PolyTech 2 can regenerate on its own. We'll focus on these two parts. A hydraulic phase is defined here and is assigned a GUID, which is an identifier, like a name tag given to the phase. Side note, PolyTech 2 doesn't actually need it to be a GUID format, it's just checking for a string, so we can actually give it any name tag we want, so I've done that here to make it easier to follow. Stages are then defined here. The hydraulic phases are then called here in the stages section. You can see that in this example, these two hydraulic phases are being called in the same stage. And unlike the stages, there isn't a cap to how many phases you can put inside of a stage. One problem though, because all of the hydraulic phases are on the same stage, they all want to activate at the same time. For a stage, everything within it begins when the stage starts. Except that PolyTech 2 has a useful feature. You can add a start delay on things so that they will begin after a certain amount of time since the stage has started, whether that's a car, a boat, or in this case, a hydraulic phase. Let's look at this on a timeline. Here, this line shows where the stage begins, and this line shows where the stage finishes. And in between, we have all of our hydraulic phases stacked on top of each other. You can see some of these hydraulic phases last shorter than others as they don't have any hydraulics active. If we stagger the delays on these such that they no longer overlap, then the end of the stage is extended and each hydraulic phase can activate one after the other as if we just created a series of stages. Now, in-game, this delay is capped to 300 seconds. However, what the game is reading is a number called a float, which can store values to the necessary precision we need up to over 500,000 seconds, or more than 8,500 hours. So it's safe to say we have enough runtime. This not only bypasses the limited number of hydraulic phases, but also solves the inconsistent frame rate issue. Because unlike the stages in series, where the frames are dependent on their previous neighbor, it is instead measured relative to when the stage has begun. Unintentionally, this also helps out on the refresh rate. Here I'm just keeping the hydraulic phases spaced apart so that the stages don't interfere with each other. However, remember that the hydraulics only last for about a quarter of a second. The instructions that tell the hydraulics to activate happen at the start of each of these phases. So we can instead squish the phases together such that they overlap, and it will still work. This speeds up our refresh rate by about 3 times. But this is also assuming the hydraulics even need to pull completely. Even with the shortest length hydraulic, the roads quickly turn black before they even finish contracting. So we can shrink the delay even more, down to just 0.1 seconds, increasing our refresh rate up to over 10 times the speed. So, with a much better system in place and Python under our belt, Concord got to programming. after 4 years since its conception, we proudly present the following. It's worth emphasizing, this is one layout file, and it works entirely in vanilla. There is an ID to the level in the description below so you can actually play this yourself in PolyTech 2. And the level file takes up less space than the original 40 by 30 pixel video file it comes from. Our layout file is less than 3.5 megabytes, and it even has a high compression ratio of 79%, meaning in a zip file, it's not even half a megabyte. That's smaller than some images, which I think is a pretty cool achievement. And that's it. That's the story of how we made Bad Apple in Polybridge. But this isn't the end of the story for the dot matrix display. We still have a little bit more to go. At the moment, each dot has been programmed to only display in binary. However, because the dot is displayed as an X, we can actually choose one of the slashes to be black and the other white. This creates a sort of gray colored dot instead of fully black or white. Now, we can improve on this. Due to roads having a low braking strength, they can only display black and white, even with the minimum length hydraulic. However, because hydraulics are stronger, their color won't change as dramatically as roads. Using this, we can attach another set of hydraulics above with a higher contraction percentage. This higher contraction allows for the hydraulic to darken more, but not completely. We can then take advantage of contracting both hydraulics to darken it completely. This has now bumped the number of different grays we can generate from 2 to 4. Combine this with the method of having 2 different states for each slash, and that number gets bumped up to 7. So, now we have the ability to make a display that can show 7 shades of gray.
Actually, what's to stop the display from showing 50 shades of gray, am I right?
Though beyond developing this type of display entirely for that gag, this is where the story ends. Wait, but didn't you say you were going to get back to these? Well, okay. Yes. I do want to cover these, though I was having a hard time trying to slot these somewhere into the video. Not because that it would take that long to discuss, but because they would end up being the predecessor to an entirely different display type that I mentioned at the start of the video. Colored pixel displays. We will cover that sometime in the future. Oh, 2 last things before I go. 1, we're not the first people to have made Bad Apple and Polybridge. That actually goes to Kromium. I just want to shout them out on that. They did a fantastic job on it. You can find the full version of theirs in the description. And the second thing is I haven't even written this down in the script, so I'm just gonna go completely scriptless. I am recording with a new mic. This mic was gifted to me by TheLazyComet, so thank you so much. If you guys haven't checked out his stuff, he also does Polybridge content. I've actually done a collaboration with him. I had a layover in California, and I actually did a video with him during my layover, so you can actually check it out on his channel.
There we go. Nice.
Nice. Okay, off to you.
Jesus Christ, man.
I will link that also in the description. And yeah, I think that's it. All right, that's all. So this last bit I'm just quickly re-recording one more time because I ended up missing my original deadline for making this before Christmas. But it's fine. I did at least make it before New Year. So happy holidays to everybody. Thank you so much for watching. And I hope everybody has a happy New Year. Love you all. Bye bye.